You Only Live Twice by Ian Fleming. Obituary. The Times. Commander James Bond, CMG RNVR. M. writes, As your readers will have learned from earlier issues, a senior officer of the Ministry of Defense, Commander James Bond, is missing, believed killed, while on an official mission to Japan. It grieves me to have to report that hopes of his survival must now be abandoned. It therefore falls to my lot to give some account of this officer and of his outstanding services to his country. The nature of Commander Bond's duties with the Ministry, which were incidentally recognized by the appointment of CMG, must remain confidential, nay, secret. But his colleagues at the Ministry will allow that he performed them with outstanding bravery and distinction, although occasionally, through an impetuous strain in his nature, with a streak of the foolhardy that brought him in conflict with higher authority. It only remains to conclude this brief in memoriam by assuring his friends that Commander Bond's last mission was one of supreme importance to the state. James Bond was briefly married to Teresa, only daughter of Marc-Ange Draco of Marseille. The marriage ended in tragic circumstances that were reported in the press at the time. There was no issue of the marriage, and James Bond leaves, so far as I am aware, no relative living. Some months earlier, Sir James Maloney lit a cigar and waved a flame to and fro across its tip until he had got it going to his satisfaction. He observed the corrugated brow of his host with affection and irony. He said, "All right, my friend. Now tell me, what's the problem?" M's mind was elsewhere. He said vaguely, "What problem?" Sir James Maloney was the greatest neurologist in England. He was also nerve specialist by appointment to the Secret Service, and, though he was rarely called in, and then only in extremis, the problems he was required to solve intrigued him greatly because they were both human and vital to the state. "My friend," he said, "like everybody else, you have certain patterns of behavior. One of them consists of occasionally asking me to lunch, stuffing me like a goose, and then letting me in on some ghastly secret and asking me to help you with it. Come on, M. Get it off your chest." M looked him coldly in the eye. "It's 007. I'm getting more and more worried about him." "You've read my 2 reports on his condition? Anything new?" "No, just the same. He's going slowly to pieces. Late at the office, skimps his work, makes mistakes. He's drinking too much, and it all adds up to the fact that one of my best men is on the edge of becoming a security risk. Absolutely incredible, considering his record." Sir James Maloney shook his head with conviction. "It's not in the least incredible. You either don't read my reports or you don't pay enough attention to them. I have said all along that the man is suffering from shock. This agent of yours is just as tough and brave as I expect you were at his age. He's a bachelor and a confirmed womanizer. Then he suddenly falls in love, partly, I suspect, because this woman was a bird with a wing down and needed his help. It's surprising what soft centres these so-called tough men always have. So he marries her, and within a few hours she's shot dead by this super-gangster chap. What was his name?" "Blofeld," said M. "Ernst Stavro Blofeld." "All right. And your man got away with nothing worse than a crack on the head. But then he started going to pieces, and your M.O. thought he might have suffered some brain injury and sent him along to me. Nothing wrong with him at all. Nothing physical, that is. Just shock. He admitted to me that all his zest had gone, that he wasn't interested in his job anymore, or even in his life. I hear this sort of talk from patients every day. It's a form of psychoneurosis, and it can grow slowly or suddenly. In your man's case, it was brought on out of the blue by an intolerable life situation, or one that he found intolerable because he had never encountered it before. The loss of a loved one, aggravated in his case by the fact that he blamed himself for her death. I thought, and I said so in my report, that his job, its dangers and emergencies and so forth, would shake him out of it. Have you tried him on any tough assignments in the last few months?" "2, said M. drearily. He bungled them both. On one he nearly got himself killed, and on the other he made a mistake that was dangerous for others. That's another thing that worries me. He didn't make mistakes before. Now, suddenly, he's become accident-prone. Another symptom of his neurosis. What are you going to do?" "Fire him," said M brutally. "Just as if he'd been shot to pieces or got some incurable disease. I've got no room in his section for a lame brain. Whatever his past record or whatever excuses you psychologists can find for him. Pension, of course, honourable discharge and all that." M looked defensively into the clear blue comprehending eyes of the famous neurologist. He said, seeking support for his decision, "You do see my point, Sir James. I'm tightly staffed at headquarters, and in the field, for that matter. There's no place where I can tuck away 007 so that he won't cause harm." "You'll be losing one of your best men." "Used to be. Isn't any longer." Sir James Maloney sat back. He looked out of the window and puffed thoughtfully at his cigar. He liked this man, Bond. He'd had him as his patient perhaps a dozen times before. He'd seen how the spirit, the reserves in the man, could pull him out of badly damaged conditions that would have broken the normal human being. He knew how a desperate situation would bring out those reserves again, how the will to live would spring up again in a real emergency. He turned back to M. "Give him one more chance, M. If it'll help, I'll take the responsibility." "What sort of chance are you thinking of?" "Well, now, I don't know much about your line of business, M, but haven't you got something really sticky, some apparently hopeless assignment you can give this man? I don't mean necessarily dangerous, like assassination or stealing Russian ciphers or whatever, but something that's desperately important but apparently impossible. By all means, give him a kick in the pants at the same time if you want to, but what he needs most of all is a supreme call on his talents, something that'll really make him sweat so that he's simply forced to forget his personal troubles. It would be easy enough if a war broke out. Nothing like death or glory to take a man out of himself. But can't you dream up something that simply stinks of urgency? If you can, give him the job. It might get him right back on the rails. Anyway, give him the chance. Yes?" Bond took his usual place across the desk from M's chair. M was standing by the big window, looking out across the park. Bond noticed that there was no file on the expanse of red leather in front of the chair. Suddenly he felt really bad about everything. About letting M down, letting the service down, letting himself down. This empty desk, the empty chair were the final accusation. "We have nothing for you," they seemed to say. "You're no use to us anymore. Sorry. It's been nice knowing you, but there it is." M came over and sat heavily down in the chair and looked across at Bond. "You know why I've sent for you?" "I can guess, sir. You can have my resignation." M said angrily, "What in hell are you talking about? It's not your fault that the 00 section's been idle for so long. It's the way things go. You've had flat periods before now, months with nothing in your line." "But I made a mess of the last 2 jobs, and I know my medical's been pretty poor these last few months." "Nonsense. There's nothing the matter with you. You've been through a bad time. You've had good reason to be a bit under the weather. As for the last 2 assignments, anyone can make mistakes. But I can't have idle hands around the place, so I'm taking you out of the 00 section." Bond's heart had temporarily risen. Now it plummeted again. The old man was being kind, trying to let him down lightly. He said, "Then if it's all the same to you, sir, I'd still like to put in my resignation. I've held the 00 number for too long. I'm not interested in staff work, I'm afraid, sir, and no good at it either." M did something Bond had never seen him do before. He lifted his right fist and brought it crashing down on the desk. "Who the devil do you think you're talking to? Who the devil do you think's running this show? God in heaven! I sent for you to give you promotion and the most important job of your career, and you talk to me about resignation, pig-headed young fool." Bond was dumbfounded. A great surge of excitement ran through him. What in hell was this all about? He said, "I'm terribly sorry, sir. I thought I'd been letting the side down lately." "I'll soon tell you when you're letting the side down." M thumped the desk for a second time, but less hard. "Now listen to me. I'm giving you acting promotion to the diplomatic section. 4-figure number and extra pay. You won't know much about this section, but I can tell you there are only 2 other men in it. You can keep your present office and your secretary if you like. In fact, I would prefer it. I don't want your change of duty to get about. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "In any case, you'll be leaving for Japan inside a week. The Chief of Staff is handling the arrangements personally. Not even my secretary knows about it. As you can see," M waved his hand, "there's not even a file on the case. That's how important it is." "But why have you chosen me, sir?" Bond's heart was thumping. This was the most extraordinary change in his fortunes that had ever come about. 10 minutes before he had been on the rubbish heap, his career, his life in ruins, and now here he was being set up on a pinnacle. What the hell was it all about? "For the simple reason that the job's impossible," M replied. "No, I won't go as far as that. Let's say totally improbable of success. You've shown in the past that you have an aptitude for difficult assignments. The only difference here is that there won't be any strong-arm stuff." M gave a frosty smile. "None of the gunplay you pride yourself on so much. It'll just be a question of your wits and nothing else. But if you bring it off, which I very much doubt, you will just about double our intelligence about the Soviet Union. You know a bit about cryptography?" "The bare bones, sir. I've preferred to keep clear of the subject. Better that way in case the opposition never got hold of me." "Quite right. Well now, the Japanese are past masters at it. They've got the right mentality for finicky problems in letters and numbers. Under CIA guidance, they've built incredible cracking machines, and for the last year they've been reading the cream of the Soviet traffic from Vladivostok and Oriental Russia. Diplomatic, naval, Air Force, the lot. That's terrific, sir. Terrific for the CIA. Aren't they passing on to us, sir? I thought we were hand in glove with CIA all along the line." "Not in the Pacific. They regard that as their private preserve." "Where do I come in?" Bond asked. M put both hands on the table. "There's a man in Tokyo called Tanaka, head of their Secret Service. He's the chap who has control of the stuff we want. You're to go out there and get it off him. How, I don't know. That's up to you. But you can see why I say you're unlikely to succeed. He's closely tied to the CIA. He probably doesn't think much of us." M's mouth bent down at the corners. "People don't these days. They may be right or wrong. I'm not a politician. He doesn't know much about the service except what he's penetrated or heard from the CIA. And that won't be greatly to our advantage, I'd say. We haven't had a station in Japan since just after the war. No traffic. It all went to the Americans. Care to have a try, James?" M's face was suddenly friendly. It wasn't friendly often. James Bond felt a quick warmth of affection for this man who had ordered his destiny for so long, but whom he knew so little. His instinct told him that there were things hidden beneath this assignment, motives which he didn't understand. Was this a rescue job on him? Was M giving him his last chance? But it sounded solid enough. The reasons for it stood up. Hopeless. Impossible. Perhaps. Why hadn't M chosen a Jap speaker? Bond had never been east of Hong Kong. But then Orientalists had their own particular drawbacks, too tied up with tea ceremonies and Zen and so forth. No, it sounded like a true bill. He said, "Yes, sir. I'd like to have a try." It was a typical Tokyo day in late summer, hot, sticky, and grey. James Bond pulled up outside a dull grey building and was scrutinized as he entered. After days of patiently waiting in a Tokyo hotel, he finally had an appointment with Tanaka, arranged by a member of the Australian Diplomatic Corps. A guard directed Bond to Tanaka's office, and a male secretary greeted him and disappeared into the inner office. He immediately reappeared, bowed, and held the door open. "Please come this way, Commander." Bond went through, and the door was softly closed behind him. A big, square figure came forward across the handsome red carpet and held out a hand that was hard and dry. "My dear Commander, good morning. It is a great pleasure to meet you." The wide, gold-toothed smile signaled welcome. The eyes glittered between long, dark lashes that were almost feminine. "Come and sit down. Please excuse the humble appearance of our offices. We have to count our pennies. I suppose it is the same with your own budget." Bond assumed that this man would know the published facts of the Secret Service vote. He said, "Under £10 million a year doesn't go far when there's the whole world to cover." The teeth glistened under the neon strip lighting. "At least for the last few years you have saved money by closing down your activities in this part of the world." "Yes. We rely on the CIA to do our work here for us. They are most efficient and helpful." "As much so under the new director as under the old?" The old fox. "Nearly so. Nowadays they are even more inclined to regard the Pacific as their own back garden." "From which you wish to borrow the mowing machine, without them knowing." Tiger's smile was even more tigerish. Bond had to laugh. The wily devil had certainly been putting two and two together. "In what respect can I be of service to you?" Tiger asked. "Is it the lawn mower?" Bond smiled. "It is. The manufacturer's trademark for this particular implement is Magic 44. This implement, which you wish to rent from us, in the most improbable event that it is made available, will command a very high price. As a fair trader, what has your country to offer in exchange for the full use of Magic 44? We have a most important intelligence network in China, known as the Macau Blue Route. The fruits of this source would be placed entirely at your disposal." Melancholy settled over Tiger's massive face, but in his dark eyes there was a wicked gleam. "I am very much afraid that I have bad news for you. Blue Route has been penetrated by my organization almost since its inception. We already receive the entire fruits of that source." Bond had to laugh. The price of Section J, and of M for that matter, the work, the expense, the danger of running the Blue Route, and at least 50% in aid of Japan. By God, his eyes were being opened on this trip. This news would put a fine cat among the pigeons at HQ. He said blandly, "We have many other commodities. May I suggest that you name your price?" "You believe that you have something on your shelves that is of comparable value? Perhaps material from a similar, though no doubt inferior source that would be of equal importance in the defense of our country?" "Undoubtedly," said Bond staunchly. "But, my dear sir, would it not be a good idea, once your mind is made up, for you to pay a visit to London and inspect the shelves for yourself? I'm sure my chief would be honored to receive you." "You do not possess full powers of negotiation." "That would be impossible. Our security is such that even I have not full knowledge of all our merchandise. So far as I am personally concerned, I am only in a position to pass on to my chief the substance of what you say, or to render you any other personal services you might ask of me." For a moment, Tiger Tanaka looked thoughtful. He seemed to be turning Bond's last words over in his mind. Then he closed the meeting, with an invitation to his home that evening, and Bond went off with mixed feelings to report to London what he had gleaned. In the room where Bond and Tanaka sat, Tiger's head snarled at him from the walls and gnashed at him from the floor. His ashtray was enclosed in a stuffed tiger's paw, and the chair in which he was sitting was upholstered in tiger's skin. Tanaka faced Bond across a low drinks table. He poured himself another liberal tot of whiskey and splashed in the soda. The sound of night traffic from the main Tokyo-Yokohama road came in from somewhere beyond the surrounding houses. It was now 10 minutes to midnight. Mr. Tanaka had become Tiger, and Commander Bond had become Bondo-san. Tiger had explained his name for James Bond. "James," he had said, "that is a difficult word in Japanese, and it does not convey sufficient respect. Bond-san is too much like the Japanese word Bon-san, which means a priest, a greybeard. The hard consonants at the end of Bond are also not easy for the Japanese, and when these occur in a foreign word we add an O. So you are Bondo-san. That is acceptable." "Does Bondo mean a pig or anything like that in Japanese?" "No, it has no meaning." "Forgive my asking. The Japanese seem to enjoy many private jokes at the expense of foreigners. I referred the other day to a friend of mine called Monkey McCall, whom we used to call Munko. You told me that this was an unmentionable word concerning female anatomy in your language, so I thought Bondo might be equally unmentionable." "Have no fear, it is totally respectable." "Now, if I have your word that nothing you hear in this room will pass outside it—" He waited for Bond's nod, then continued, "then I will tell you quite an interesting story. This is how it is." He got out of his chair and sat down on the tatami and arranged himself in the lotus position. He was obviously more comfortable in this posture. He said in an expository tone of voice, "Ever since the beginning of the era of Meiji, there have from time to time been foreigners who have come to this country and settled here. They have for the most part been cranks and scholars, and have been tolerated, usually with some amusement. But there is one such person who entered the country in January of this year, who has revealed himself to be an eccentric of the most devilish nature. This man is a monster. You may laugh, but this man is no less than a fiend in human form." "I have met many bad men in my time, and generally they have been slightly mad," commented Bond. "Is that the case in this instance?" "Very much the reverse. The calculated ingenuity of this man, his understanding of the psychology of my people, show him to be a man of quite outstanding genius. In the opinion of our highest scholars and savants, he is a scientific research worker and collector, probably unique in the history of the world." "What does he collect?" "He collects death." James Bond smiled at this dramatic utterance. "A collector of death? You mean he kills people?" "No, it is not as simple as that. He persuades, or rather entices people to kill themselves." Tiger paused. The wide expanse of his brow furrowed. "No, that also is not being just. Let us just say that he provides an easy and attractive opportunity, a resort, for people to do away with themselves. His present tally in just under 6 months is something like 500 Japanese." "Why don't you arrest him, hang him?" "It is not as easy as that. I had better begin at the beginning. In January of this year, there entered the country a gentleman by the name of Dr. Guntram Shatterhand. He was accompanied by his wife, Frau Emmy Shatterhand. They had Swiss passports, and the doctor described himself as a horticulturalist and botanist specializing in subtropical species. He was prepared to spend no less than £1 million on establishing an exotic garden or park in this country, which he would stock with a priceless collection of rare plants and shrubs from all over the world. The park was not to be open to the public, but would be freely available for study and research work by Japanese experts. All right. A wonderful offer that was enthusiastically accepted by the government, who, in return, granted the good doctor a 10-year residence permit, a very rare privilege. Meanwhile, as a matter of routine, the immigration authorities made inquiries about the doctor through my department. Since I have no representative in Switzerland, I referred the matter to our friends of the CIA, and in due course he was given complete clearance. So, a financially sound citizen whose harmless pursuits would be of some benefit to Japan. Yes? Sounds like it. After traveling around the country in great style,
The doctor took a fancy to a semi-ruined castle in Kyushu, a southern island. An army of builders and decorators moved in. Meanwhile, the plants ordered by the doctor began arriving from all over the world, and with a blanket customs clearance from the Ministry of Agriculture, they were planted in appropriate soils and settings. Here, I should mention that an additional reason for the doctor's choice of site was that the property, which extends for some 500 acres, is highly volcanic and furnished with many geysers and fumaroles, which are common in Japan. These would provide all the year round the temperature needed for the successful propagation of these tropical shrubs, trees, and plants from the equatorial zones. The doctor and his wife, who is, by the way, extremely ugly, moved into the castle with all speed and set about recruiting staff in the neighborhood who would look after the establishment and its grounds. Here, Tiger assumed his sorrowful face. And it was at this time that I should not have dismissed as fanciful certain reports that reached me from the chief of police at Fukuoka. You see, this man Shatterhand has created what I can only describe as a garden of death. Bond raised his eyebrows. Really, for the head of a National Secret Service, Tiger's metaphors were almost ridiculously dramatic. Tiger exploded his golden smile. I can see from your face that you think I am either drunk or mad. Now listen. This Dr. Shatterhand has filled this famous park of his uniquely with poisonous vegetation, the lakes and streams with poisonous fish, and he has infested the place with snakes, scorpions, and poisonous spiders. He and this hideous wife of his are not harmed by these things because whenever they leave the castle, he wears full suits of armor of the 17th century, and she wears some other kind of protective clothing. His workers are not harmed because they wear rubber boots up to the knee and antiseptic gauze masks. You see what I mean?
No, said Bond. Frankly, I don't. What's the object of the good doctor's exercise? Tiger wiped his hand over his face. He said, Did you read a story in the Japan Times today? It concerned a suicide. No. This was a young student, aged 18, who had failed his examination for the university for the second time. There was construction work on a new department store going on near where he lived. He went out of his room onto the site. A pile driver was at work sinking the foundations. Suddenly this youth broke through the surrounding workmen, and as the pile came crashing down, laid his head on the block beneath it. What a ghastly business. Why? He had brought dishonor on his parents, his ancestors. This was his way of expiation. Suicide, you must remember, Bondo-san, is very much a part of the Japanese way of life. 25,000 Japanese commit suicide every year. What's it got to do with friend Shatterhand and his pretty garden? Everything. You see, much against the good doctor's wishes, of course, his poison garden has become the most desirable site for suicides in the whole of Japan. It has everything. A ride on our famous Romance Express to Kyoto, a boat trip across our beautiful inland sea that is so full of Japanese history, a local train from the terminal harbor at Beppu to Fukuoka, and a walk or taxi drive along a beautiful coast to the awe-inspiring ramparts of this mysterious castle of death. Climb these, or smuggle yourself in on a provision cart, and then a last ruminative walk, perhaps hand in hand with your lover through the beautiful groves. And finally, the great gamble. Will your death be painful or easy? Will a viper strike at your legs as you walk the silent paths? Will some kindly deadly dew fall upon you during the night as you rest under this or that gorgeous tree? Or will hunger or curiosity lead you to munch a handful of those red berries or pick one of those orange fruits? The place is nothing more than a department store of death, its shelves laden with delicious packages of self-destruction, all given away for nothing. The police have erected a barricade across the road. Genuine visitors, botanists, and so on have to show a pass. But the suicides fight their way to the shrine across the fields and marshes, scrabble at the great walls, break their nails to gain entrance.
The good doctor is, of course, very much dismayed. He has erected stern notices of warning with skulls and crossbones upon them. They act only as advertisements. He has even gone to the expense of flying one of those high helium balloons from the roof of his castle. The hanging streamers threaten trespassers with prosecution. But alas for the doctor's precautions. The high balloon serves only to beckon. Here is death, it proclaims. Come and get it.
Why don't you arrest him? Burn the place down?
Arrest him for what? For presenting Japan with this unique collection of rare plants? Burn down £1 million establishment belonging to a respected resident? The man has done nothing wrong. If anyone is to blame, it is the Japanese people. But his tally so far is over 500. And with the stream of publicity, more and more people will be attracted to the Castle of Death. We have got to put a stop to it.
But how has all this come on your plate? Bond was now getting drowsy. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and the horizon of jagged grey porcelain-shingled rooftops was lightening. He poured down the last of the sake. It had the flat taste of too much. It was time he was in bed. But Tiger was obviously obsessed with this lunatic business, and he seemed unaffected by the lateness of the hour.
1 month ago, Tiger told him, I sent one of my best men into this place to try and discover what it was all about. I was so instructed by the Minister of the Interior. He, in turn, was under orders from the Prime Minister. My man was instructed to get into the place, observe, and report. 1 week later, he was recovered from the sea on a beach near this Castle of Death. He was blinded and in delirium. The lower half of his body was terribly burned. He could only babble a haiku about dragonflies. This haiku, that is a traditional Japanese verse of 17 syllables, which he kept on reciting until his death, which came soon, was desolation, pink dragonflies flitting above the perfumed graves.
I'm sorry. What did you do next? Bond asked. Tiger Tanaka seemed to sit slightly more upright. He looked very directly at James Bond and said,
What was there to do? I did nothing except apologize to my superiors. I waited for an honorable solution to present itself. I waited for you to come.
Me?
You were sent. It might have been another.
James Bond yawned. He said, It's time for bed. Let's talk about the rest of this tomorrow. Of course, I'll give you any advice I can. I can see it's a difficult problem, but those are just the ones to sleep on. He made to rise from his chair. Tiger said, and it was an order, Sit down, Bondo-san. If you have any regard for your country. From now on, you are under my personal orders. The voice went very quiet and velvety. Is that understood? Bond sat up as if he'd been stung. What in God's name are you talking about? Tiger Tanaka said, In my office yesterday you made a significant statement. You said words to the effect that, in exchange for Magic 44, you were empowered to carry out any personal services that I might require of you. I didn't say that I was empowered. I meant that I would do anything for you on my personal responsibility. That is quite good enough. I took you at your word, and I spoke to my superior. He instructed me to proceed, but to regard the matter as a state secret, known only to him and to me, and of course to you. Bond said impatiently, What is it you want me to do? You are to enter this Castle of Death and slay the dragon within. The black car hurtled through the deserted streets, which were shiny with the dew of what would be a beautiful day. Bond and Tiger were on the way to a bathhouse, which Tiger said was of a very special, a very pleasurable nature. It was also, Tiger said, very discreet, and the opportunity would be taken to make a start in transforming Bond's appearance into something more closely resembling a Japanese. Tiger had overridden all Bond's objections. On all the evidence, this doctor was a purveyor of death. For obvious reasons of policy, his assassination, which had been officially agreed to, could not be carried out by a Japanese. Bond's appearance on the scene was therefore very timely. He had had much practice in such clandestine operations. Bond argued that he had personally nothing against this Swiss botanist. Tiger replied that any good man's hand would be against a man who had already killed 500 of his fellow creatures. Was that not so? And in any case, Bond was being hired to do this act in exchange for Magic 44. Did that not quieten his conscience? Bond agreed reluctantly that it did. As a last resort, Bond said that the operation was, in any case, impossible. A foreigner in Japan could be spotted 5 miles away. Tiger replied that this matter had been provided for, and the first step was a visit to this most discreet bathhouse. Here Bond would receive his first treatment and then get some sleep before catching the train on which Tiger would be accompanying him, and Tiger, with a devilish grin, had assured him that at any rate part of his treatment would be most pleasurable. In more ways than one, it was a new man who followed Tiger through the thronged halls of Tokyo Main Station the next day. Bond's face and hands were of a light brown tint. His black hair, brightly oiled, was cut and neatly combed in a short fringe that reached halfway down his forehead, and the outer corners of his eyebrows had been carefully shaved so that they now slanted upwards. He was dressed, like so many of the other travellers, in a white cotton shirt, a cheap knitted silk black tie, and ready-made black trousers, held up by a cheap black plastic belt. In his pocket were a comb, a cheap used wallet containing some 5,000 yen, and a stout pocket-knife. Despite his height, Bond merged quite adequately into the bustling, shoving crowd. The gleaming orange and silver train slid to a stop beside Bond and Tiger. Tiger barged his way on board. Bond waited politely for 2 or 3 women to precede him. When he sat down beside Tiger, Tiger hissed angrily, "First lesson, Bondo-san. Do not make way for women. Push them, trample them down. Women have no priority in this country. You may be polite to very old men, but to no one else. Is that understood?" "Yes, master," said Bond. "And do not make Western-style jokes while you are my pupil. We are engaged on a serious mission." That evening they sat in their room in Toba waiting for dinner. The sake arrived first. Tiger had been thoughtful. He had ordered tumblers. Bond swallowed his at one gulp. Tiger said, "The grossness of your drinking habits fits well with your future identity." "And what is that to be?" "A coal miner from Fukuoka. There are many tall men in that profession. Your hands are not rough enough, but you pushed a truck underground. You are deaf and dumb. Here." Tiger pushed across a scrubby card, creased and dog-eared. There were some Japanese characters on it. "If someone talks to you, show that and they will desist. They may also give you a few pieces of small coin. Accept them and bow deeply." "Thanks very much. And I suppose I have to account for these tips in your secret fund?" "That will not be necessary." Tiger was wooden-faced. "Our expenses on this mission are a direct charge on the Prime Minister's purse." Bond bowed. "I am honored." The headquarters for the local department of the Sosaka, the CID, was just off the main street of Fukuoka. Tiger was received with pomp. The office of the chief of the CID was small and cluttered. Superintendent Ando himself looked to Bond like any other Japanese salaryman, but he had a military bearing, and the eyes behind the rimless spectacles were quick and hard. Bond sat patiently smoking while much conversation went on. A blown-up aerial mosaic of the Castle of Death and the surrounding country was produced from a filing cabinet and laid out on the desk. Superintendent Ando weighed down the corners with ashtrays, and Tiger called Bond over. "Please examine this photograph, Bondo-san. The superintendent says that a clandestine approach from the landward side is now very difficult. The suicides pay local peasants to lead them through the marshlands," he pointed, "and there are recognized breaches in the walls surrounding the property which are constantly changed and kept open for the suicides. Every time the superintendent posts a guard at one of them,
Another is made known to the peasants by the castle guards. He says he is at his wit's end. 20 bodies have been fetched to the mortuary in the past week. The superintendent wishes to hand in his resignation."
"Let's have a look," Bond said. At first glance, Bond's heart quailed. The estate covered the whole expanse of a small promontory that jutted out into the sea from a rocky coast, and the 200-foot cliff round the promontory had been riveted with giant stone blocks down to the breaking waves to form an unbroken wall that sloped slightly up to the gun ports and the irregularly sited tiled watchtowers. From the top of this wall there appeared to be a 10-foot drop into the park, heavily treed and shrubbed between winding streams, and a broad lake with a small island in its centre. At the back of the property stood the castle, protected from the low-lying countryside by a comparatively modest wall. It would be over this wall that the suicides gained access. The castle itself was a giant 5-storied affair in the Japanese tradition, with swooping winged roofs of glazed tile. Bond picked up a large magnifying glass and ran over the whole property inch by inch. But there was nothing more to be gleaned, except the presence of an occasional diminutive figure at work in the park. Bond laid down the glass. He said gloomily, "That's not a castle. That's a fortress. How am I supposed to get into the bloody place?"
"The superintendent asks if you are a good swimmer. I have had a complete outfit sent down from my ninjutsu establishment. The seaward wall would present no problems."
"I can swim well enough, but how do I get to the base of the wall? Where do I start from?"
"The superintendent says there is an Ama island, called Kuro, only half a mile out to sea."
"What's an Ama island?"
"They exist at different places around Japan. I believe there are some 50 such settlements. The Ama are a tribe whose girls dive for the awabi shells. That is our local abalone, a clam. It is a great delicacy. The superintendent is distantly related to a family on Kuro. It is a most interesting family. There is a father and a mother and one daughter. She is called Suzuki. I have heard of her. When she was 17, she became famous in Japan by being chosen to go to Hollywood to make a film. They wanted a Japanese diving girl of great beauty, and someone had heard of her. She made the film, but hated Hollywood and longed only to return to her Ama life. Kissy will now be 23, and everyone has forgotten about her. The superintendent says that he could arrange for you to stay with this family. They seem to have some obligation towards him. He says it is a simple house, but comfortable because of the money this girl earned in Hollywood. The other houses on the island are nothing but fishermen's shacks."
"So I stay on this island, and then one night I swim across to the wall. How do I get up it?"
"You will have the ninja outfit. It is very simple."
"Then what do I do?"
"You hide up in the grounds and wait for an opportunity to kill Shatterhand. How you do that is up to you. If his wife is with him, you will kill her too. She's certainly involved in all this business, and anyway she is too ugly to live. Then you escape over the wall and swim back to Kuro. There you will be picked up by the police launch, who will visit the place at once. The news of the death will quickly get around."
Bond said doubtfully, "Well, it all sounds very simple. Now let's have a look at a photograph of this chap. Has the superintendent got one?" The superintendent went to the bottom of his file, extracted what looked like a blown-up copy of Dr. Shatterhand's passport photograph, and handed it over. Bond took it nonchalantly. Then his whole body stiffened. He said to himself, God Almighty, yes! There was no doubt at all. He'd grown a drooping black moustache. He'd had the syphilitic nose repaired. There was a gold-capped tooth among the upper frontals, but there could be no doubt. Bond looked up. He said, "Have you got one of the woman?" Startled by the look of controlled venom on Bond's face, and by the pallor that showed through the walnut dye, the superintendent bowed energetically and scrabbled through his file. Yes, there she was, the bitch. The flat, ugly, wardress face, the dull eyes, the scraped-back bun of hair. Bond held the pictures, not looking at them, thinking. Ernst Stavro Blofeld, Irma Bunt. So this was where they'd come to hide, and the long, strong gut of fate had lassoed him to them. They of all people, he of all people. Could they smell him coming? Had the dead spy got hold of his name and told them? Unlikely. The power and prestige of Tiger would have protected him. Privacy, discretion are the heartbeat of Japanese inns. Bond looked up from the pictures. He was in cold control of himself. This was now a private matter. It had nothing to do with Tiger or Japan. It had nothing to do with Magic 44. It was an ancient feud. James Bond laughed. It was a laugh that grated. Even to Bond, it sounded harsh and false in the small room. He had immediately made up his mind to keep his knowledge to himself. To reveal the true identity of Dr. Shatterhand would be to put the whole case back into official channels. The Japanese Secret Service and the CIA would swarm down to Fukuoka. Blofeld and Irma Bunt would be arrested. James Bond's personal prey would be snatched from him. There would be no revenge. Bond went through the rest of the day like an automaton. While he tried on the ninja equipment and watched each item being carefully packed into a floatable plastic container, his mind was totally occupied with the image of his enemy. This man Blofeld, the great gangster who had founded Spector, the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge and Extortion. The man who was wanted by the police of all the NATO countries. The man who had murdered Tracy, Bond's wife, for less than a day, a bare 9 months ago. And in those 9 months, this evil genius had invented a new method of collecting death, as Tiger had put it. Blofeld must have gone off his head, but with a monstrous, calculating madness, the madness of the genius he undoubtedly was. And now the two enemies were lined up again. But this time, David was spurred on to kill his Goliath, not by duty, but by blood feud. James Bond, Tiger, and the superintendent drove down the main street to where the police launch was waiting at the jetty, and set off at a good 20 knots across the beautiful bay and round the headland into the Sea of Genkai. Tiger produced sandwiches and a flask of sake for each of them, and they ate as the jagged green coast with its sandy beaches passed slowly by to port. Tiger pointed out a distant dot on the horizon. Kuro Island. The small speck grew larger and soon revealed itself as a horned island about 5 miles in circumference. On the mainland, Dr. Shatterhand's small peninsula soared up out of the breaking waves. The castle's formidable silhouette reminded Bond vaguely of photographs of Alcatraz taken from sea level. He shivered slightly at the thought of a night swim across the half-mile channel and of the black spider that would then scale those soaring foundations. Ah, well. He turned his attention back to Kuro Island. It appeared to be made of black volcanic rock, but there was much green vegetation right up to the summit of a small peak, on which there was some kind of a stone beacon. When they rounded the headland that formed one arm of the bay, a crowded little village and a jetty appeared. The little boats were winging their way back from the day's fishing. The entire population of Kuro, some 200 souls, was lined up along the shore to greet the heroines of the day, the older people holding carefully folded shawls to warm up the girls on their way to their homes. It was now 5 o'clock. They would be asleep by 8, said Tiger, and out again with the dawn. Tiger was sympathetic. You will have to adjust your hours, Bondo-san, and your way of life. The Ama live very frugally, very cheaply, for their earnings are small. And for heaven's sake, be polite to the parents, especially the father. As for Kissy—" He left the sentence hanging in the air. Eager hands reached for each boat, and with happy shouts pulled it up on the black pebbles. The chattering, smiling girls waded in through the shallows and cast modestly appraising glances at the 3 mainland strangers on the jetty. To Bond, they all seemed beautiful and gay in the soft evening light. At that moment he felt ashamed of his city-slicker appearance, let alone the black designs it concealed. One girl, rather taller than the rest, seemed to pay no attention to the men on the jetty, or to the police launch riding beside it. She was the center of a crowd of laughing girls as she waded with a long stride over the shiny black pebbles and up the beach. A wizened old woman held out a coarse brown blanket to her, and she wrapped it round herself, and the group dispersed. The couple, the old woman and the young one, walked up the beach to the market. The young one talked excitedly. The old one paid attention and nodded. The superintendent was waiting for them, and they listened to him, casting occasional glances towards the group on the jetty. The tall girl drew her blanket more closely around her. James Bond had guessed it already. Now he knew. This was Kissy Suzuki. The three people came along the jetty, the girl hanging back. The women stopped, and the superintendent came forward. Tiger translated for him. "He says that the father and mother of Kissy Suzuki would be honored to receive you in their humble abode, for whose poverty they apologize. They regret that they are not accustomed to Western ways, but their daughter is proficient in English as a result of her work in America, and will endeavor to convey your wishes to them. He asks if you can row a boat. The father who previously rowed for his daughter is stricken with rheumatism. It would be of great assistance to the family if you would deign to take his place." Bond said, "I would be honored to have a place to lay my head in the home of Suzuki-san. My needs are modest, and I greatly enjoy the Japanese way of life. I would be most pleased to row the family boat or help the household in any other way." He added sotto voce, "Tiger, I may need these people's help when the time comes, particularly the girls. How much can I tell her?" Tiger said softly, "Use your discretion. She will not spread it abroad. And now come forward and be introduced. Don't forget, your name here is Taro, which means first son, Todoroki, which means thunder." Bond was led forward to the two women. He bowed low to the mother, but he remembered not to bow too low, as she was only a woman, and then he turned to the girl. She laughed gaily. She didn't titter or giggle like all the other Japanese girls he had met so far. She actually laughed. She said, "You don't have to bow to me, and I shall never bow to you." She held out her hand. "How do you do? My name is Kissy Suzuki." The hand was ice cold. Bond said, "My name is Taro Todoroki, and I am sorry to have kept you here for so long. You are cold, and you ought to go and have your hot bath. It is very kind of your family to accept me as your guest, but I do not want to be an imposition. I have been cold before. When you have finished with your distinguished friends, my mother and I will be happy to lead you to our house. I hope you are good at peeling potatoes." "I took a degree in it," said Bond delightedly. Thank God for a straightforward girl at last. No more bowing and hissing. "What time do we take out the boat?" he asked. "About 5:30, when the sun comes up. Perhaps you will bring me good luck." Farewells were brief. Dusk was creeping up over the sea, and the orange ball of the sun had already lost its brilliance in the evening haze. The engine of the police boat had been started up, and its exhaust bubbled softly. Bond thanked the superintendent, and was wished good fortune in his honourable endeavours. Tiger looked serious. He took Bond's hand in both of his and said, "Bondo-san, I am certain you will succeed, so I will not wish you luck, nor will I say sayonara. Farewell." "Thanks for everything, Tiger. See you in about a week." Tiger got down into the boat, and the engine revved up. Tiger raised a hand in salute, and then the boat was round the sea wall and out of sight. Dawn was a beautiful haze of gold and blue. Bond went outside and ate his bean curd and rice and drank his tea sitting on the spotless doorstep of the little house, while indoors the family chattered like happy sparrows as the women went about their housework. Kissy came out of the house. She was wearing a kind of white cotton nightdress and a white cotton kerchief bound up the thick waves of her hair. She wore her equipment over the white dress, only her arms and feet were bare. Bond's face may have shown his disappointment. She laughed, teasing him. "This is the ceremonial dress for diving in the presence of strangers. It is a mark of respect." "Kissy, I believe that is a fib. The truth of the matter is that you consider that your nakedness might arouse dishonourable thoughts in my impious Western mind. That is a most unworthy suspicion. However, I accept the delicacy of your respect for my susceptibilities. And now let's get going." She went back indoors and brought out the balsa wood tub and a great coil of fine 1/4-inch rope. She handed the rope to Bond and hoisted the tub on her hip, leading the way along a small path away from the village. The path descended slowly to a small cove in which one rowing boat was docked. Kissy climbed into the boat and settled herself. Bond came in after her and slid the heavy, narrow-bladed oars into their wooden rowlocks. He began rowing at a powerful, even pace, more or less, under Kissy's direction, due north. Soon the sweat began to pour down Bond's face and chest into his bathing pants. Kissy undid the kerchief round her hair and leant forward and mopped at him gently. Bond smiled into her almond eyes and had his first close-up of her snub nose and petalled mouth. She wore no make-up, and did not need to, for she had that rosy-tinted skin on a golden background, the colours of a golden peach, that is quite common in Japan. Her hair, released from its kerchief, was black with dark brown highlights. It was heavily waved, but with a soft fringe that ended an inch or so above the straight, fine eyebrows that showed no signs of having been plucked. Her arms and legs were longer and less masculine than is usual with Japanese girls, and Bond could see that her breasts and buttocks were firm and proud, and that her stomach was almost flat, a beautiful figure. But it was the charm and directness of her eyes and smile, as well as her complete naturalness, that endeared her so utterly to Bond. At that moment he thought there would be nothing more wonderful than to spend the rest of his life rowing her out towards the horizon during the day, and coming back with her to the small, clean house in the dusk. He shrugged the whimsy aside. Only another 2 days to the full moon, and he would have to get back to reality. He put the prospect out of his mind. Today and the next day would be stolen days. Days with only Kissy and the boats and the birds and the sea. He must just see to it that they were happy days, and lucky ones for her and her harvest of seashells. The second day was as golden as the first, and so was the third. Bond said to the girl, "Kissy, tonight I have to swim to the castle and climb the wall and get inside." She nodded. "I know this. And then you are going to kill this man. You are the man who we believe was to come to Kuro from across the sea and do these things. But why have you been chosen? Why should it not be another, a Japanese? The people on the island are gaijin, foreigners. I am a gaijin too. It will cause less trouble for the state if the whole matter is presented as being trouble between foreigners." "And if, after, will you come back and be my boatman again?" "For a time. But then I must go back to England." "I shall be swimming with you tonight." She held up a hand to stop his protestations. "You will need company in the dark, and I know the currents. You would not get there without me." Bond took her small dry hand in his. He looked at her childish broken nails. His voice was harsh. He said, "No, this is man's work." She looked at him. The brown eyes were calm and serious. She said, "Taro-san, your other name may mean thunder, but I am not afraid. I have made up my mind, and what is more, I shall come back every night, at midnight exactly, and wait among the rocks at the bottom of the wall. I shall wait for 1 hour in case you need my help in coming home. These people may harm you. In any case, I shall hardly sleep until you come back. To feel that I am close to you for a time, and that you may need me, will give me some peace. Say yes, Taro-san." "Oh, all right, Kissy," said Bond gruffly. "I was only going to ask you to row me to a starting point across the straits, but if you insist on being an extra target for the sharks—" "The sharks never trouble us. They just think we are big fish like themselves." She laughed happily. "Now it is all settled." It was just after 11 o'clock, and the giant moon rode high and fast through wisps of mackerel cloud. They talked softly, although they were out of sight of the fortress and half a mile away from it. Kissy took off her brown kimono and folded it neatly and left it on the rocks. Her body glowed in the moonlight. Bond carefully pulled on his ninja suit of black cotton. It was comfortable enough and would give warmth in the water. He left the head shroud hanging down his back and pushed the goggles up his forehead. The small floating pack he was to tow behind him rode jauntily in the waters of the creek, and he tied its string firmly to his right wrist so that he would always know it was there. He smiled at Kissy and nodded. She came up to him and threw her arms around his neck and kissed him full on the lips. Before he could respond, she had pulled down her goggles and had dived into the quiet Mercury Sea. Kissy's crawl was steady and relaxed, and Bond had no difficulty in following the twinkling feet and the twin white mounds of her behind. For the first half of the swim they were heading diagonally against the easterly current through the straits, but then Kissy slightly changed her direction, and now they could paddle lazily in towards the soaring wall that soon became their whole horizon. Bond pulled himself up on the rocks and extracted the packet of iron pitons from the container he'd towed behind him. He blew a kiss to the girl. She replied with a sideways wave of her hand, and then was off across the sea again, a luminous white torpedo, and merged quickly into the path of the moon. Bond put her out of his thoughts. He was getting chilled in his soaking black camouflage, and it was time to get moving. It took him 20 minutes to cover the 200 feet of slightly inclined wall, but he only had to use his pitons twice when he came to cracks that were too narrow to give a hold to his aching toes. And then he was at one of the gun ports. He slithered quietly across its 6 feet of flat masonry and cautiously looked over the edge into the park. As he had expected, there were stone steps down from the gun port, and he crept down these into the dark shadows at its base and stood up against the inside of the wall, panting quietly. He waited for his breath to calm down, and then slipped back his cowl and listened. Not a wisp of wind stirred in the trees, but from somewhere came the sound of softly running water, and in the background a regular glutinous burping and bubbling. The fumaroles. Bond, a black shadow among the rest, edged along the wall to his right. His first task was to find a hideout, a base camp where he could bivouac in emergency and where he could leave his container. He reconnoitred various groves and clumps of bushes, but they were all damnably well kept, and the undergrowth had been cleared from their roots. Many of them exuded a sickly sweet, poisonous night smell. Then up against the wall he came upon a lean-to shed, its rickety door ajar. He listened, and then inched the door open. As he had expected, there was a shadowy jumble of gardeners' tools, wheelbarrows, and the like, and the musty smell of such places. Moving carefully, and helped by shafts of moonlight through the wide cracks in the planked walls, he got to the back of the hut, where there was an untidy mound of used sacking. He reflected for a moment, and decided that though this place would be often visited, it had great promise. He untied the cord of the container from his wrist and proceeded methodically to move some of the sacks forward so as to provide a nest for himself behind them. When it was finished, and final touches of artistic disarray added, he parked his container behind the barrier and crept out again into the park to continue what he planned should be a first quick survey of the whole property. Bond was now on the castle side of the lake. He heard a noise and edged behind a tree. The distant crashing in the shrubbery sounded like a wounded animal, but then down the path came staggering a man, or what had once been a man. The brilliant moonlight showed a head swollen to the size of a football, and only small slits remained where the eyes and mouth had been. The man moaned softly as he zigzagged along, and Bond could see that his hands were up to his puffed face and that he was trying to prise apart the swollen skin round his eyes so that he could see out. Suddenly he stopped. He seemed to see the lake for the first time. With a terrible cry, and holding out his arms as if to meet a loved one, he made a quick run to the edge and threw himself in. At once there came the swirl of movement that Bond had noticed before, but this time it involved a great area of water, and there was a wild boiling of the surface round the vaguely threshing body. A mass of small fish were struggling to get at the man, and their 6-inch bodies glittered and flashed in the moonlight. Once the man raised his head and let out a single terrible scream, and Bond saw that his face was encrusted with pendant fish, as if with silvery locks of hair. Then his head fell back into the lake, and he rolled over and over, as if trying to rid himself of his attackers. But slowly the black stains spread around him, and he finally lay still, face downwards in the water, and his head jigged slightly with the ceaseless momentum of the attack. James Bond wiped the cold sweat off his face. Piranha. The Herr Doctor had certainly provided a feast for his victims. Unending dishes for their delectation. A true banquet of death. James Bond shuddered, and went on round the last mile of wall and back to the gardener's hut. He took a last look round before going in. He could see a neck of the lake about 20 yards away. It was now gun-metal in the approaching dawn. Some big insects were flitting and darting through the softly rising steam. They were pink dragonflies. But of course, the haiku of Tiger's dying agent. That was the last nightmarish touch to this obscenity of a place. Bond went into the hut, picked his way carefully between the machines and wheelbarrows, pulled some sacks over himself, and fell into a shallow sleep, full of ghosts and demons and screams. At 6 o'clock in the evening, dusk came like a slow drawing of a violet blind over the day. Crickets began to sing in a loud chorus, and geckos chuckled in the shrubbery. Bond got up and stretched and shook the dust out of his hair and clothes. At 9 o'clock he left the hideout. He took the same route as the night before, came through the same belt of trees. He noticed for the first time that the warning balloon with its advertisement of danger was tethered to a pole on the corner of the balustrade surrounding what appeared to be the main floor, the second. Here, from several windows, yellow light showed faintly, and Bond guessed that this would be his target area. He strode quietly off across the gravel and came without incident to the tiny entrance under the wooden bridge. Bond took a pencil flashlight and a small steel file out of his pocket and set to work on a link of the chain. Using the file as a lever, he bent the link open and quietly removed the padlock and chain from its stanchions. He took out his torch and pushed the door open, probing the darkness ahead with its thin beam. It was as well he did so. On the stone floor where his first step past the open door would have taken him lay a yawning man-trap, its rusty iron jaws perhaps a yard across, waiting for him to step on the thin covering of straw that partially concealed it. Bond winced, as in his imagination he heard the iron clang as the saw teeth bit into his leg below the knee. There would be other such booby-traps. He must keep every sense on the alert. Nothing but velvety darkness. He was in some vast underground cellar. He crept slowly forward, watching only the rough stone flags ahead of him. He passed 1 or 2 bulky arched pillars, and now the great cellar seemed to narrow because he could just see walls to the right and left of him, and above him an arched cobwebby roof. Yes, here were the stone steps leading upwards. He climbed them softly until he came to the entrance, a wide double door. He pushed it open, and found himself in a long wooden corridor that sloped on upwards. At the end was another door, and behind it showed a thin strip of light. As he walked up the incline, he could hear music coming from behind the door. It was Wagner, the Ride of the Valkyries. "Thank you, Blofeld," thought Bond. Most helpful cover. When it came, there was absolutely no warning. One step across the exact halfway point of the flooring, and like a seesaw the whole 20 feet of floorboard swiveled noiselessly on some central axis. Bond, arms and legs flailing and hands scrabbling desperately for a grip, found himself hurtling down into a black void. As his body plunged off the end of the platform into space, an alarm bell, triggered by the mechanism of the trap, brayed hysterically. Bond had a fractional impression of the platform, relieved of his weight, swinging back into position above him. Then he crashed shatteringly into unconsciousness. Bond swam reluctantly up through a dark tunnel towards the blinding pinpoint of light. It expanded, became an expanse of straw-covered floor on which he was crouching while the open hand crashed sideways into his face. With each slap, the splitting pain in his head exploded into 1,000 separate pain fragments. He could see indistinctly through a mist of pain. Careful now. You're a deaf and dumb miner from Fukuoka. To hell with the pain in your head. Nothing's broken. Play it cool. He realized for the first time that he was naked save for the brief V of the black cotton ninja underpants. He got to his feet. The guard gestured him out of the cell. Blofeld, dressed in a magnificent black silk kimono across which a golden dragon sprawled, stood leaning against a mantelpiece beneath which a Japanese brazier smouldered. Beside him, completing the picture of a homely couple at ease after dinner, sat Irma Bunt, in the full regalia of a high-class Japanese lady. By God, thought Bond dully, here they are, within easy reach. They would both be dead by now but for his error. Might there still be some way of turning the tables, if only the pain in his head would stop throbbing? Blofeld's tall sword stood against the wall. He picked it up and strode out into the room. He stood over a pile of Bond's possessions and picked them over with the tip of the sword. He hooked up the black suit. "And what is this?" he asked the guard. "It is a ninja suit. This man has undoubtedly been sent to assassinate you, my lord. But for the magic of the passage, he might well have succeeded. He carries a paper saying that he is deaf and dumb, and other papers stating that he is a miner from Fukuoka. I do not believe this. His hands have some broken nails, but they are not the hands of a miner." "I do not believe it either. But we shall soon find out." Blofeld turned to the woman. "What do you think, my dear?" Irma Bunt rose and came and stood beside him. She looked piercingly at Bond and then walked slowly round him, keeping her distance. When she came to the left profile, she said softly, with awe, "Du lieber Gott." She went back to Blofeld. She said in a hoarse whisper, still staring at Bond, "It cannot be, but it is. The profile." She turned to Blofeld and said decisively, "This is the English agent. This is the man Bond, James Bond, the man whose wife you killed." Blofeld's eyes narrowed. "I see a certain resemblance. But how has he come here? How has he found me? Who sent him?" "It must be the Japanese Secret Service. They will certainly have relations with the British." "I cannot believe it," snarled Blofeld. "If that was so, they would have come with warrants to arrest me. We must extract the whole truth from this man. We must find out at once if he is deaf and dumb. That is the first step. The question room should settle that." Bond was pushed down a passage and into a bizarre room of roughly hewn stone that was very hot and stank of sulphur. Blofeld and the woman entered. The door was closed. A guard gestured Bond to the end of the room where there was a raised stone pedestal seat with arms. It dripped with drying grey mud, and there was the same volcanic filth on the floor all around it. Above the stone seat in the ceiling there was a wide circular opening through which Bond could see a patch of dark sky and stars. Bond was gestured to sit down on the stone throne. In the centre of the seat there was a large, round hole. Bond did as he was told, his skin flinching at the hot, sticky surface of the mud. He rested his forearms wearily on the stone arms of the throne and waited, his belly crawling with the knowledge of what this was all about. Blofeld spoke from the other end of the room. "Commander Bond, this is the question room, a device of my invention that has the most inevitable effect of making silent people talk. As you know, this property is highly volcanic. You are now sitting directly above a geyser, which is regulated to throw mud
at a heat of around 1,000 degrees centigrade, a distance of approximately 1,000 feet into the air on exactly each 15th minute in every hour. Your body is now at an elevation of approximately 50 feet directly above its source. You will note from the clock on the wall that it will erupt in precisely 11 minutes. If it is true that you cannot hear me, then you will not move from that chair, and you will suffer a most dreadful death by the incineration of your lower body. If, on the other hand, you leave the seat before the death moment, you will have demonstrated that you can hear and understand, and you will be put to further tortures which will make you answer my questions. This will now be repeated to you in Japanese, in case your papers are perhaps partially correct."
Bond paid no attention. He sat relaxed and gazed round the room. A small wooden box in the corner caught his eye. Inside that box would undoubtedly be the regulating valve for the geyser, the wheel that controlled the pulse. If it were screwed down, the whole castle could go up. Could that bit of knowledge be put to some use? Bond tucked it away and racked his tired brain for some kind of plan. The clock uttered a deep iron tick. It ticked 9 times more. Bond looked up at the black-and-white face. It said 11:14. A deep, angry grumble sounded from deep down beneath him. It was followed by a hard buffet of very hot breath. Bond got to his feet and walked slowly away from the stinking stone vent until he reached the area of the floor that was not wet with mud. Then he turned and watched. The grumble had become a far-away roar. The roar became a deep howl that swelled up into the room like an express train coming out of a tunnel. Then there was a mighty explosion, and a solid jet of grey mud shot like a gleaming grey piston out of the hole Bond had just left, and exactly penetrated the wide aperture in the ceiling. The jet continued absolutely solid for perhaps half a second, and searing heat filled the room so that Bond had to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Then the grey pillar collapsed back into the hole, and mud spattered onto the roof of the place and splashed down into the room in great steaming gobbets. The stench of sulphur was sickening. In the total silence that followed, the tick of the clock to 11:16 was as loud as a gong stroke. Searing heat filled the room. Bond turned and faced the couple at the end of the room. He said cheerfully, "Well, Blofeld, you mad bastard, I'll admit that your effects man down below knows his stuff. Now bring on the 12 she-devils, and if they're all as beautiful as Fräulein Bunt, we'll get Noel Coward to put it to music and have it on Broadway by Christmas. How about it?" Blofeld turned to Irma Bunt. "My dear girl, you are right. It is indeed the same Britisher. And now let us finish with this man once and for all. It is beyond our bedtime." Back up the stone passage, Blofeld went back to his stance by the mantelpiece, his hand resting lightly on the boss of his great sword. Irma Bunt was close by him. Bond decided to hell with the Fukuoka miner. There was a writing desk next to the bookshelves. He pulled out its chair and sat down. There were cigarettes and matches. He lit up and sat back, inhaling luxuriously. Might as well make oneself comfortable before one went for the big sleep. Blofeld pointed to the pile of Bond's possessions on the floor. "Take these away," he said to the guards, "and wait with the other men outside." He turned to Bond. "And now, talk, and you will receive an honorable and quick death by this sword. If you do not talk, you will die slowly and horribly, and you will talk just the same. Well?" Bond said easily, "Blofeld, you were never stupid. Many people in London and Tokyo know of my presence here tonight. At this moment you might argue your way out of a capital charge. You have a lot of money, and you could engage the best lawyers, but if you kill me, you will certainly die." "You are not telling the truth," returned Blofeld. "If my presence here was officially known, a small army of policemen would have been sent to arrest me. One of my agents recently reported that the head of the Japanese Secret Service, a certain Tanaka, came down in this direction accompanied by a foreigner dressed as a Japanese. I now see that your appearance tallies with my agent's description.
I will hazard a guess that fits the facts. This man Tanaka has already lost one senior agent whom he sent down here to investigate me. You were available on some business concerning your profession, perhaps, and for some consideration, or in exchange for a favor, you agreed to come here and kill me, thus tidying up a situation which is causing some embarrassment to the Japanese government. I do not know or care when you learned that Dr. Shatterhand was in fact Ernst Stavro Blofeld. You have your private reasons for wanting to kill me, and I have no doubt that you kept your knowledge to yourself, for fear that official action would take the place of your private plans. Blofeld paused. I have one of the greatest brains in the world, Mr. Bond. Have you anything to say in reply? Bond took another cigarette and lit it. He said composedly, I stick to the truth, Blofeld. If anything happens to me, you will be dead by Christmas. All right, Mr. Bond. But I am so sure of my facts that I am going to kill you now with my own hands and dispose of your body without more ado. You have been a thorn in my flesh for too long. In former days, in this country, if a low person hindered the samurai's passage along the road or failed to show him proper respect, the samurai was within his rights to lop off the man's head. I regard myself as a latter-day samurai. My fine sword has not yet been blooded. Yours will be an admirable head to cut its teeth on. He turned to Irma Bunt. You agree, mein Liebchen? The square wardress face looked up from its petit point. But of course, lieber Ernst, what you decide is always correct. But be careful. This animal is dangerous. You forget, mein Liebchen, since last January he has ceased to be an animal. By a simple stroke of surgery on the woman he loved, I reduced him to human dimensions. The dominant, horrific figure stood away from the mantelpiece and took up his sword. Let me show you. Bond dropped his lighted cigarette and left it to smoulder on the carpet. His whole body tensed. He said, I suppose you know you're both mad as hatters. So was Frederick the Great. So was Nietzsche. So was Van Gogh. We are in good, in illustrious company, Mr. Bond. On the other hand, what are you? You are a common thug, a blunt instrument wielded by dolts in high places. Twice before your chief has sent you to do battle with me, Mr. Bond, and by a combination of luck and brute force you were successful in destroying 2 projects of my genius. You will not be successful a 3rd time. Blofeld was a big man, perhaps 6'3" and powerfully built. He placed the tip of the samurai sword between his straddled feet and rested his sinewy hands on its boss. He took a step forward and then raised his mighty sword in both hands and held it above his head. The light from the oil lamps shimmered on the blade and showed up the golden filigree engraving. Bond knew what to do. He had known as soon as he had been led back into the room and had seen a stave carelessly left standing in a shadowed angle of the wall. But there was a bell push near the woman. She would have to be dealt with first. Bond hurled himself to the left, seized the staff, and leapt at the woman whose hand was already reached upwards. The stave thudded into the side of her neck, and she sprawled grotesquely forward on the floor and lay still. As Blofeld's sword whistled down, Bond feinted to the left, but he was inches too slow, and the tip of the sword flicked his left ribs, drawing blood. Before Blofeld could withdraw, Bond slashed two-handed sideways at his legs. The stave met bone. Blofeld cursed and made a stab at Bond's weapon. Then he advanced again, and Bond could only dodge and feint in the middle of the room to make quick, short lunges to keep the enemy at bay. He was losing ground in front of the whirling steel, and now Blofeld, scenting victory, took lightning steps and thrust forward like a snake. Bond leapt sideways, saw his chance, and gave a mighty sweep of his stave. It caught Blofeld on his right shoulder and drew a curse from him. His main sword arm. Bond pressed forward and scored several hits to the body. One of Blofeld's parries caught the stave and cut off the vital foot of extra length as if it had been a candle end. Blofeld saw his advantage and began attacking, making furious forward jabs that Bond could only parry by hitting at the flat of the sword to deflect it. But now the stave was slippery in the sweat of his hands, and Bond felt the cold breath of defeat at his neck. Blofeld seemed to smell it, for he suddenly executed one of his fast-running lunges to get under Bond's guard. Bond counter-lunged, swept the sword aside with his stave, and dropping his weapon, made a dive for Blofeld's neck and got both hands to it. For a moment, the two sweating faces were almost up against each other. The boss of Blofeld's sword battered into Bond's side. Bond hardly felt the crashing blows. He pressed and pressed with his thumbs, and heard the sword clang to the floor, and felt Blofeld's fingers and nails tearing at his face, trying to reach his eyes. Bond whispered through his gritted teeth, "Die, Blofeld, die!" Then suddenly the fiend's tongue was retching out, and the mad eyes rolled upward, and the body slipped down to the ground. But Bond followed it, and knelt, his hands cramped around the powerful neck, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, in the terrible grip of bloodlust. Bond slowly came to himself. He unclasped his aching hands from round the neck, and not looking again at the purple face, got to his feet. He staggered. God, how his head hurt. What remained to be done? He tried to cast his mind back. He had had a clever idea. What was it? Oh, yes, of course. He picked up Blofeld's sword and sleepwalked down the stone passage to the question room. There was the wooden box, mud-spattered. He went to it and hacked it open with one stroke of the sword. Yes, there was the big wheel where he had expected. He kneeled down and twisted until it was finally closed. What would happen now? The end of the world? Bond ran up the passage. Now he must get out, get away from this place. But his line of retreat was closed by the guards. He tore aside a curtain and smashed the window open. Outside there was a balustraded terrace that seemed to run round this story of the castle. Bond looked around for something to cover his nakedness. There was only Blofeld's kimono. Coldly Bond tore it off the corpse, put it on, and tied the sash. The interior of the kimono was cold, like a snake's skin. He looked down at Irma Bunt. She was breathing heavily. Bond went to the window and climbed out, minding his bare feet among the glass splinters. But he had been wrong. The balustrade was a brief one, closed at both ends. He looked over the side, a sheer 100-foot drop to the gravel. A soft fluted whistle above him caught his ear. He looked up. It was only a breath of wind in the moorings of the bloody balloon. But then a lunatic idea came to him. This helium balloon was strong enough to hold taut 50 feet of framed cotton strip bearing the warning signal. Why shouldn't it be powerful enough to bear the weight of a man? Bond tested the mooring line. It was as taut as a wire. From somewhere behind him there came a great clamour in the castle. Had the woman woken up? Holding on to the straining rope, he climbed onto the railing, cut a foothold for himself in the cotton banner, and grasping the mooring rope with his right hand, chopped downwards below him with Blofeld's sword, and threw himself into space. It worked. There was a light night breeze, and he felt himself wafted gently away over the moonlit park, over the glittering lake, towards the sea. But he was rising, not falling. The helium sphere was not in the least worried by his weight. Then blue and yellow fire fluttered from the upper story of the castle, and an occasional angry wasp zipped past him. Bond's hands and feet were beginning to ache with the strain of holding on, and now the whole black silhouette of the castle swayed in the moonlight and seemed to jig upwards, then slowly dissolve like an ice-cream cone in sunshine. The top story crumbled first, then the next, and then, after a moment, a huge jet of orange fire shot up from hell towards the moon. A buffet of hot wind, followed by an echoing crack of thunder, hit Bond and made his balloon sway violently. It worked. The geyser had exploded, taking the castle of death with it. The pain in Bond's head was his whole universe, and punctured by a flying piece of rubbish, the balloon was rapidly losing height. Below, the softly swelling sea offered a bed. Bond let go, with hands and feet, and plummeted down towards peace, towards the rippling feathers of some childhood dream of softness and escape from pain. When Kissy saw the figure, black-winged in its kimono, crash down into the sea, she sensed that it was her man.
and she covered the 200 yards from the base of the wall as fast as she had ever swum in her life. The tremendous impact with the water had at first knocked all the wind out of Bond, but the will to live, so nearly extinguished by the searing pain in his head, was revived by the new but recognizable enemy of the sea. And when Kissy got to him, he was struggling to free himself from the kimono. At first, he thought she was Blofeld and tried to strike out at her. "It's Kissy," she said urgently. "Don't you remember?" He didn't. He had no recollection of anything in the world but the face of his enemy and of the desperate urge to smash it. But his strength was going, and finally, cursing feebly, he allowed her to manhandle him out of the kimono. With his head cradled between her breasts, she set off with the traditional backward leg stroke. It was an amazing swim for a girl. 1/2 a mile with currents to contend with, and only the moon and an occasional glance over her shoulder to give her a bearing. But she achieved it, and finally hauled Bond out of the water in her little cove and collapsed on the flat rocks beside him. She was awoken by a groan from Bond. He sat with his head in his hands, looking blankly out to sea with the glazed eyes of a sleepwalker. When Kissy put an arm around his shoulders, he turned vaguely towards her. "Who are you? How did I get here? What is this place?" He examined her more carefully. "You're very pretty." Kissy looked at him keenly. She said, and a sudden plan of great glory blazed across her mind, "You cannot remember anything? You do not remember who you are and where you came from?" Bond passed a hand across his forehead, squeezed his eyes. "Nothing," he said wearily. "Nothing except a man's face. I think he was dead. What is your name? You must tell me everything." Kissy took a deep breath before she spoke. "My name is Kissy Suzuki, and you are my lover. Your name is Taro Todoroki. We live on this island and go fishing together. It is a very good life. But can you walk a little? I must take you to where you live and get you some food and a doctor to see you. You must have fallen while you were climbing the cliffs after seagulls' eggs." She stood up and held out her hands. Bond took them and staggered to his feet. She held him by the hand and gently guided him along the path towards the Suzuki house. And so the days ran into weeks, and the police came again and again from Fukuoka, and the official called Tanaka came from Tokyo. But the island of Kuro kept its secret. Meanwhile, James Bond's body gradually mended in Kissy's loving care. But then, he didn't know that his name was James Bond.